So today we're discussing passages from pages 20 to 21 from this boy's life. And we have with us Mr. Johnson.
Good morning.
Miss Aziz.
Hello.
Mrs. Buzzard.
Hello, everyone.
And I'm Mr. Simons. Why don't we kick this off by having a look at these pages in terms of the context of a person's life, in particular this boy's life, and also the context of a narrative. What do you think? What do you think Mr. Wolf is saying about what it is like to be a boy growing up?
Well, I think perhaps probably one of the most prominent ideas within these passages is the difficulty that he faces, and I think particularly the difficulty that he faces regarding his self-image. What we see the opening of page 21 and in the first couple of lines is that he wants to keep his promises, but it's something that he finds completely inevitable, and the inevitability of him breaking the promises and the sense of guilt that he feels as a result.
Yeah. So we make these promises about ourselves, and especially him within this narrative makes these promises. Why doesn't he keep them?
I think for him it's an inability to keep these promises, and I think the draw or the thirst for either the risk-taking behaviour that we see throughout the memoir, or certainly the way in which he wants to push boundaries in whatever area, whether it be how he looks, how he acts, or how he speaks, it means that he's certainly at odds with what people expect of him, and in one level, what he expects of himself, I would argue.
Yeah.
I think it's also a lot about power, this scene. He gets a thrill with the fact that he gets away with it. And the weapon, the rifle, I think, it's a motif, symbolises both the possession of power and violence combined. And I don't think you can separate who Toby wants to be from the historical and social context because of the 50s, the highly gendered society, the macho kind of society. He aspires to be like Roy, who is a macho who doesn't treat his mother well. There's lots of references to him keeping her in her place and making sure she's submissive. So I think it's sort of like there's a line in here where it talks about how when he imagines himself, his image, he imagines himself with a gun. So to me, I think it's about him trying to attain power in a situation where he actually feels quite powerless. So that's my reading.
Yeah, you said that almost like his desire for power. Does his desire for power overwhelm his desire to keep his promises? Is it a conscious process that he has, or is it an unconscious pull?
I think it's conscious because he does lots of things to try and procrastinate and to stop it from happening. Like on page 20, it tells us how he starts by cleaning it. Then from cleaning it, he has to, what does he do next? He marches around the apartment with it. Then he strikes poses with it. It's almost like an addiction for him, the way it's described. And then it says later on, I think he goes to the couch and makes himself a sandwich to try and avoid doing it. And then once he does pull out the gun, right. He says, I made sure I wasn't at home for a few days, because it's too tempting for him.
Yeah.
Because, what we're essentially seeing is a deterioration of his self-control, is that with each and every action that he's committing, particularly during this scene on page 20, is that it starts out as a young boy sort of playing dress-ups and also with the guns, but what we see is that sinister element is introduced there at the bottom of page 20 up to 21, where we have that interjection.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting, like you're saying, Mrs. Buzzard, that he doesn't seem to have any control over himself and his actions to some degree. And there's very much this idea that he doesn't have any power over himself, yet he yearns to have power over others, which is what draws him to the gun, that for a point in his life he's able to feel powerless. But immediately, actually on the next page, on 22, is the quote you mentioned, about all my images of myself as I wish to be were images of myself armed, and that they had power over me. So there's this shifting backwards and forwards of things having power over him, but him desiring to have power over others. And I wonder if him killing the squirrel is slightly an echo of later Dwight killing the beaver. There's these images of men killing, vulnerable animals, which are symbolic of those people within the memoir who don't have power, and those sort of rough men who exert their masculinity in a very strong way that influences Toby.
So Dwight himself doesn't have power over his own faculties.
So he picks on defenseless animals because it's a way for him to at least express some of that frustration that he has.
But it's the paradox of the theme as well, isn't it, of power, that you have the powerful, which of course means that you're going to have the powerless. And I think the interjection from senior Tobias Wolff, and something that I stress to my students, is that they need to consider that this is not a teenage boy writing about his life, this is an older man reflecting on his life.
Yeah.
And when there's the interjection where he reflects upon this experience and links it to his experience of service in Vietnam, what we see here is that it's quite a profound insight at the top of page 21 there. Or from the bottom of page 20 rather. I saw it years later in men I served with, and felt it myself when unarmed Vietnamese civilians talked back to us while we were herding them around. Power can be enjoyed only when it is recognised and feared. Fearlessness in those without power is maddening to those who have it. And I would probably argue that this is one of the most profound and insightful quotes within this chapter of Fortune, in that it allows us this insight into not only what it feels like to have power in quite a corrupt sense, what he experiences later on, but also to feel powerless. Toby, or Jack, within this scene is irritated by people's ignorance of the power that he feels he wields over these pedestrians and passers-by. And I think, and then to fast forward later on, the comment that you made, Miss Buzzard, that he gets away with it. Well, I would probably argue that in some respects he doesn't get away with it. And that's something that we see throughout the memoir, is that he can't escape the feelings of guilt or remorse, in this instance anyway, of his actions.
Yeah.
I think that point you made about the senior Tobias Wolff was really good, particularly with that quote about the fearlessness. That shows a lot of insight. Tobias Wolff is very much an adult here, talking about what he's learnt over time about power.
We have license to do that because he himself refers to his experience in Vietnam. So we get to talk outside the text in that way.
And I think also when he says on page 22, where he says, though I avoided the apartment, I could not shake the idea that sooner or later I would get the rifle out again. All of my images as myself I wished to be were images of myself armed, because I did not know who I was. An image of myself, no matter how grotesque, had power over me. So I thought that links into your point before, Mrs. Aziz. But this much I understand now. So again, you get the senior Tobias Wolff. But the man can give no help to the boy, not in this matter, nor in those that follow. The boy moves always out of reach. I really like that quote. I think that's really interesting. Just before we talk about that, I was just going to clarify with what I was saying before about him getting away with it. I meant with the adults in his life,
Yes.
but not with himself. He definitely doesn't get away with it, because the whole memoir, really, in a lot of ways, is sort of cathartic in the sense that he's sort of reflecting on all his past transgressions.
Yes. Oh, so the memoir itself could be seen as him not getting away with it because he is bearing his darkest secrets to the world.
Well, this is the real confession he should have made. The confessions that he's not able to make in his childhood, either to the priest or, again, at the end on page 21, you see him imitating someone praying, he says towards the end. Again, it's all about this striking a pose, isn't it? Or assuming a pose that sort of echoes the epitaphs twice, really. First, the striking this brave pose. He wants to, first of all, pose as the military person, his connection to Western heroes of American history, his love of the Scouts, because a uniform gives him a form of identity. And then this whole idea of not having power over himself links back to that corruption, that he who fears corruption fears life. Toby is so easily corrupted, even by his own ideas of himself.
Do you read that as being very, quite harsh on his younger self? You read that as him being very cynical about youth?
The bit about the epigraph about corruption, or the bit about
Well, the way he views himself, in terms of the way he describes his the lack of ability to confess. Is he frustrated with himself as an older self, or is he? How does he feel?
I don't think it's with the comment that Miss Buzzard said regarding it's impossible for an older self or an older man to provide a younger version of oneself with advice. And students need to be able to, when they're writing about this memoir for a text response essay, be able to pick out these structural points that that Woolf puts in. I think in terms of criticism, I don't think it's criticism as such, but it's an honesty that, while I'm reading it, that it has taken him a great deal of time to come to terms with.
He describes the younger self as being out of reach, almost as if the writer wants to exert power over the younger, but can't. So there's linking back in there, the fearlessness of those without power is maddening to those who have it. So the writer has power, but can't exert it over the younger self.
But that's similar to, I suppose, while I was reading it, a sense of frustration as I read through the entire memoir, that you just want to sort of say to Jack or Toby, what are you doing? In terms of sort of the not just the corrupting every possibility that he seems to have in life because he can't help himself.
Like Father Carl, who says, what are you doing? Like, he literally says, what are you doing?
Absolutely, and I think even upon reflection, Tobias Wolff, looking back at younger Jack or Toby, is unable to, and I think he sees it as futile, trying to sort of reprimand himself or criticise himself for those actions, and it's just an underlying sense of honesty, I think, that pervades the memoir.
Maddening. Certainly feels maddening to read in some instances. Like you feel so frustrated with Toby and his particularly myself, I felt really frustrated with his inability to apologise and confess.
Yeah, I think being able to show remorse is really important for people to forgive you, and so in a way it's hard to forgive Toby or Jack completely as you're reading. I feel very mixed feelings towards him. I sympathise with him in certain moments, particularly when he's subject to a lot of abuse, especially by Dwight. But I'm less sympathetic towards him when it's obvious the choices he makes are leading him down a dark path and leading him down the path that he doesn't actually want. He wants a conventional life, or so he says, and yet he seems to take action to do anything, to achieve anything but that a lot of the time.
Do you sympathise with this passage and this boy holding a gun and pointing it at strangers? I mean, that sounds pretty stark when I put it like that, but did you, when you read the passage itself?
I feel sympathetic for the fact that he has, as he calls it on page 22, the poverty of my own identity. I thought that was a really powerful line, because he talks about Sister James having a robust identity made him feel the poverty of my own.
Yes.
I think it's sad that he has such a weak sense of identity and is so confused about who he is that he has to do this. But I'm also not sympathetic because I'm thinking of all the innocent people on the street and the squirrel who are subject to this almost mad child. Not mad, but he's behaving in a pretty scary manner.
It's a very sinister passage, isn't it?
Yeah.
With that in mind, a line halfway through page 21 where it says, "When my mother got home from work, I told her there was a dead squirrel in the street. Like me, she was an animal lover." And this is a phrase that certainly my class gasped at.
Yes.
And I had to explain, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on what you see here in terms of after this horrific act that he's done in killing the squirrel, then to try to share some sort of empathy or emotional connection with his mother in the actual death and burial of the squirrel.
So why does he say that he's an animal lover? Is he an animal lover?
I think he is. I think he's totally torn between this sort of act of rebellion, but also desperately wanting to conform. He keeps saying that, that he likes to hide, this camouflage. There's something really appealing about the Boy Scouts, about the army with its structure and its rules. So there's this sort of conflict, even within himself, between desperately wanting freedom and escape and to be his own person and rebelling, and then also liking the kind of structured life of military uniforms, the army. There's sort of security in that identity.
What does that represent civilization? Because you think about the animals, we've got the squirrel, we've got the beaver, we've got Champion.
The dog.
He doesn't seem to express any real affection for any
No.
of those, but he really wants to associate with his mother. Kind of reflecting later on where he chooses to stay because he can keep his mother's name. So that's really important to him.
Which that comment on identity, I think, draws on to another really interesting point within this passage that we've not touched on, and that is the theme or the issue of Catholicism or Christianity, particularly in these early passages of the memoir, and the difficulty or the complexity of him having to adopt the catechism classes or this Catholic belief or Christian indoctrination, whatever you would like to call it.
Yeah.
Basically as a trade-off for his name.
Yeah.
So if we're thinking about it in terms of identity, that his mother says the only way you're going to be able to adopt this this abbreviation or this completely new identity is if you adopt these Christian values, which I think is a really interesting point.
Right. Like a sanctification process or a
Absolutely.
purification process.
And, well, arguably.
Well, it doesn't work.
No, it certainly doesn't. But then on page 21, we see a number, I think, of issues and conflicts that arise out of these catechism classes that he has or has not, as the case is, been attending, and that is certainly making the cross out of the popsicle sticks and having this Christian burial for the squirrel, which of course, essentially, if we're looking towards the Ten Commandments, he is killed or he's slain. And then the repentance that he wants to absolve himself of, or the sins that he wants to absolve himself of, in this parody of prayer and repentance at the bottom of page 21 is almost farcical.
Yes.
That he knows what he's supposed to do or what his Christian beliefs would deem him to do or what is suitable, and yet he's unable to do it, but he tells himself that it's better.
Not even almost. I think the repetition of the word imitation there is literally an imitation. He's pretending, which is absurd, because a lot of his other imitations, his deceptions, his farces are for the purpose of something else or someone else in particular, in front of someone. But here, there's no one else around. Unless we see God as the other.
Yeah, he's sort of experimenting with versions of himself and how he'd like to see himself. He'd like to be this pious, sort of repentant person. It's just one of the versions of himself that he's quite enamoured with. There's the image of him as the soldier man, the image of him as the pious man, the good son, the good student. They're all sort of things he would like to be but can't quite make it because of either that he's so easily corrupted. Nothing quite feels comfortable that he tries on. Nothing quite works.
Which is that idea of the ideal self. I think the Carl Rogers, that psychologist who came up with that idea. It's probably Maslow as well, isn't it?
I think all children do that they have fantasies about the person they would like to be or role models that they aspire to be and sort of experiment with different identities. It feels like that's what Toby's doing, is experimenting with who he would like to be.
That brought up a really interesting question I still haven't been able to answer. But to what degree are the poses we strike actually us? Because I would identify myself with teaching as a teacher, but when I'm in front of a class, I definitely strike a pose. And we all strike poses with different relationships and different circumstances. Is he a rifleman? Is he a scout? Is he none of those things? Because if he's none of those poses, then he's not really anything at all.
I think part of him and the essence of him being Tobias Wolff at this stage in his life is this almost this continuum of trial and error in terms of self. And if we look at the acknowledgements page at the very beginning of the memoir, where he says, I've allowed some of these points to stand because this is a book of memory and memory has its own story to tell, but I've done my best to make it a truthful story. My stepfather used to say that what I didn't know would fill a book. Well, here it is. And of course, you can't help but to produce a wry smile when you read that, because what doesn't he know, and what is he accused of not knowing? He doesn't know life at this point, and certainly during these early stages of adolescence for him, and striking a pose for many adolescents, but particularly for Jack and Toby, who has a number of issues regarding sort of self-esteem and also insecurities from both the social and historical context of the time. I think part of that process of finding one's identity is him, and I think they're inextricably linked.
So his authentic self is the one which he finds along the way.
I would argue that his authentic self, if we could label it that for anyone,
Yeah,
we're getting
sure.
a little philosophical now.
Yeah.
I think are best seen in the narrative interjections of the older Tobias Wolff.
I think so as well.
Yeah.
I think it's as though Tobias Wolff is trying to wrestle and come to terms with who he was as a young boy and his own identity as a young boy. And I think there's the honesty in the narrative interjection from the senior Tobias Wolff. I think we have to sort of trust that as being the more authentic. I think the poses are all facets of his personality and facets of his identity, but I don't really feel like they're as authentic, or that they really hold him as much, because they're so short-lived, a lot of them.
And that it's an expression of the influences that were on him at the time.
Yep.
So this whole pose is the influence Roy has on him, and that whole culture of masculinity at the time. The posing at praying is a representation of the influence of religion at this stage in his life. And each time he takes one of these poses, it's reflecting some influence that is in his life at that time.
Yeah. We've talked about with my students the idea that that's what this boy's life is. It's a construction of a life, and we witness the creation of an authentic self through the process. And I'm not even sure if I think like you've reflected, I'm not even sure if he gets there by the end of the events that are detailed within the text. But he gets there in hindsight with this reflective voice and his commentary back. Yeah. Okay, we might wrap it up there. Thanks very much.